The first clue in sheepdog DNA wasn't a trait. It was a wiring pattern. Researchers found an enrichment of variants tied to axon guidance, the process that wires the brain as it's being built. That means the instinct to move a flock and hold a line might start long before any field lesson ever does. If wiring like this is already changing the way you look at a working dog, subscribe to Dog DNA Archive before we go further. This channel exists to trace exactly these kinds of hidden signals, breed by breed. In the DNA of sheepdogs, researchers found something more precise than a vague talent for obedience, an enrichment of variants linked to genes involved in axon guidance, the process that helps nerve cells find their roots as the brain is being built. That detail changes the whole picture. It means the instinct that makes a dog move with a flock, cut off a breakaway animal, and hold a line without chaos may begin far earlier than any field lesson ever starts. The study, published in the journal Cell in 2022, examined large genomic datasets from dogs and found that within herding breeds, the signal was not just about sociability or being easy to live with. It pointed toward biology that supports a very specific kind of work. The dogs were not being explained as simply more friendly, more loyal, or more trainable. They were being read as animals shaped by selection for a task, with DNA patterns that fit the demands of movement, timing, and control. And the NIH later framed the same finding in a way that makes it even harder to dismiss as coincidence. In dogs that herd sheep, the genomic differences appear to involve how neurons organize neural circuits at the beginning of development. That is a cold, technical phrase, but the implication is vivid. Before a sheepdog ever sees a pasture, before it ever learns a command, the architecture that supports its responses is already taking shape. The brain is not being asked to improvise from scratch. It is being guided along a path that breeding has reinforced for generations. That is why the question around sheepdogs is so unsettling in the best way. If the behavior were only learned, the answer would be simple. Train the dog, reward the pattern, repeat the task. But if the DNA already carries a bias toward tracking movement, reacting quickly, resisting distraction, and staying locked onto a job, then the animal is not just a partner in the field. It is the product of a long human selection process that quietly etched function into biology. Look closely at that, and the familiar image of a dog circling a flock becomes something else. It is not random energy. It is not generic intelligence. It is an inherited choreography, built from nerve development, sharpened by work, and preserved because it worked so well that people kept choosing it again and again. If this kind of hidden structure fascinates you, stay with it, because the next layer is where the behavior stops looking ordinary and starts revealing why herding breeds stand apart from every dog bred mainly for companionship. This same wiring-based approach, reading breed instinct as inherited circuitry rather than folklore, is exactly what the material completer walks through in far more depth, gene by gene, breed by breed. It maps the specific markers tied to focus, movement, and control across working lines. The link is in the description and pinned in the first comment. Stay close, because the next study pushes this same idea across thousands of dogs at once. The first thing that changes is the scale. A claim like this can sound convincing when it comes from one clever dog, one farm, one trainer, one field where the animals seem to know what to do. But the picture becomes harder to dismiss when the evidence stretches across more than 4,000 canids, including domestic, semi-feral, and wild animals, alongside behavioral data from more than 46,000 dogs. That is the kind of sample size reported in a 2022 Cell study available through Science Direct, and it changes the conversation completely. Now the question is no longer whether a sheepdog can learn a task well. The question is whether a whole line of working dogs carries a measurable biological signature that sets it apart before the first command is ever given. In that study, the sheepdog lineage did exactly that. It did not blur into the rest of the canine map. It formed a distinct cluster, one that stood out from other dog groups rather than dissolving into them. That separation matters because it pushes against the easy assumption that herding is only a matter of intelligence, obedience, or close human bonding. The data pointed somewhere more specific. The cluster was enriched for axon guidance and for genes tied to neurodevelopment, a combination that hints at how movement, attention, and quick response may have been shaped together over generations. In other words, the animals were not merely being compared by how useful they seemed in the field. Their genomes were being read as a record of selection, And once that record came into view, a second layer appeared. The study did not describe a vague talent shared by all dogs. It suggested that shepherding lines preserve a shared architecture of variants selected for a very particular job. That is a different kind of evidence. It means the work of moving a flock left more than a memory in training manuals and farm routines. It left a pattern in inheritance itself, one that could be traced across related working lines. This is where the unease deepens, because the familiar image of a dog turning with a flock now sits beside a much larger fact. The pattern is not isolated. It is not a one-off trick passed from handler to animal. It is visible in population data, in clusters, in enrichment signals, in the kind of large comparative study that makes coincidence look less and less believable. If you want to keep following this thread, stay with it, because the next step is where the biological pattern starts to connect to the practical demands that shape these dogs in the first place. The cleaner explanation starts to break once the 2021 Frontiers in Veterinary Science study comes into view. It looked at herding, predation, temperament, and trainability with GWS, and the pattern was not a single switch hiding inside the genome. It pointed instead to a working profile built from several pieces at once. Less fear, more boldness, and the ability to stand in front of a large group of sheep or cattle without backing away. That matters because the old fantasy of one magic marker never fit the job very well. A dog does not move a flock by being pleasant in the abstract. It has to read motion, hold position, keep nerve, and keep going when the animals surge or scatter. The same paper pushed the argument further by linking herding-related traits to neurological genes. That is a different kind of clue. It means the behavior sits close to the systems that shape reaction, focus, and learned control, not at the surface of a single visible trick. The result is a polygenic picture. Many variants, each with a modest effect, combining to bias a dog toward the kind of judgment a working flock demands. In other words, the instinct is real, but it is built. If a polygenic picture like this, many small variants adding up to one working instinct, is the kind of pattern you want to keep tracing, the material completo goes further. It breaks down the specific markers tied to prey drive, temperament, and trainability, and lines them up side by side across working breeds so you can see exactly where each line's instinct comes from. The link is in the description and the first comment. A 2019 heredity study on German Shepherd dogs gave that idea a second layer of support. Using GWS and regional heritability mapping, it showed that behavioral traits in dogs can be traced through measurable signals in the genome. That is important here because it places shepherding dogs inside a broader genetic method, rather than treating them as a special case explained by intuition alone. The work does not reduce the animal to a line of code. It shows that the line is longer and folded in more ways than a simple story can hold. That is the contradiction now being resolved. The public image wants a single explanation, a neat origin, a tidy answer for why one dog can work a field while another cannot. The data refuse that simplicity. They point to selection over generations, to neurological pathways, to multiple variants shaping the same task from different angles. The instinct remains visible, but now it looks less like a switch and more like a coordinated system that was sharpened by use. If you keep following that line, the next step is not to ask whether herding is inherited. The harder question is how selection keeps certain combinations alive while letting others fade, until a working line begins to carry its own history in the way it moves, waits, and commits. In 2025, the trail narrowed to a single stretch of DNA that kept showing up in dogs built for work. In a Science Advances study available through PubMed Central, researchers identified an EPHB1 haplotype linked to higher chase bite patterns in working dogs. That detail matters because it moves the story out of broad association and into a visible action. The dog closes in, tracks motion, and commits. The marker is not describing friendliness or general trainability. It is pointing to a specific motor pattern that matters in the field, the kind that lets a dog press a flock without losing control. That same paper went further and argued that functional selection shaped the genetic architecture of herding breeds. In plain terms, generations of use did not just reward a vague talent. They kept alive combinations that helped a dog maintain control across different tasks. The result is a working line carrying a history in its biology, not as a slogan, but as a set of traits that can still be measured when the animal is put to work. And this is where the picture deepens. The genetic signal is not standing alone in a lab notebook. It lines up with field data from border collies in Norway. In 2017, researchers used sheepdog trial records to estimate heritabilities, repeatabilities, and genetic correlations for herding traits in the Journal of Animal Breeding and Genetics, published by Wiley, with the same work indexed on PubMed under 274888613. Their approach treated trial performance as usable breeding data, which is a serious shift. What happens in the ring or on the course is not just a display for judges, it is evidence. That Norwegian study is important because it links what handlers see to what breeders can measure. If a dog repeats a task well, if its scores hold steady, if one herding trait moves with another, the pattern can be modeled rather than guessed at. In other words, the trial is not only a test of skill, it becomes a window into inherited structure. When a border collie turns cleanly, holds distance and keeps pressure without breaking contact, the performance is no longer only training in motion. It is also a readout of what selection has preserved. If this kind of trackable twice-over evidence, first in the DNA, then out in the field, is changing how you look at working dogs, that's exactly the pattern this channel exists to follow. Subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments which breed's DNA you want traced next. Seen together, the 2025 EPHB1 finding and the 2017 sheepdog trial data answer a harder question than simple inheritance. They show how a working behavior becomes trackable twice over, first in DNA and then in action. That is why the contradiction has shifted. What once looked like a neat genetic signature now opens into a much wider system. A marker, a trial record, a breeding decision, and a dog whose body has been shaped to solve a task with relentless precision. If this kind of evidence changes how you read working dogs, stay with it. Because the next layer is even more revealing. The last layer is not hidden in a lab result at all. It is sitting in the way humans kept returning to the same dogs, the same task, and the same standard. On the NHGRI Dog Genome Project site, the herding behavior survey is still aimed at one very specific trait, the tendency to repeat coordinated actions, while researchers collect biological samples for genetic analysis. That detail matters because it shows the work is not a finished theory from the past. It is still active, still being measured, still asking which dogs are naturally inclined to keep moving, circling, and correcting a flock without losing focus. That continuity reaches back into history in a way that changes the meaning of the DNA results. In 2022, Nature Genetics argued that the behavioral diversity of dogs was shaped by historical breeding and human selection practices, tying genes to work rather than to companionship alone. In other words, the traits that matter here were not preserved because they made a dog simply pleasant to live with. They were kept because people needed a partner that could read motion, sustain pressure, and return again and again to the same job, without drifting away from it. The record of sheepdog trials gives that idea a physical edge. The International Sheepdog Society has documented an annual international trial running from 1906, with interruptions only during the 2 World Wars and the 2001 foot-and-mouth crisis. That is not just a sporting footnote. It is a long-running public test of what a sheepdog is supposed to be. A dog that succeeds in that arena is being judged against a standard built over generations. Control, precision, endurance, and the rare ability to think with movement, rather than against it. Seen together, the survey, the historical breeding logic, and the trial tradition point to the same conclusion from different directions. Herding in these breeds was not an accidental byproduct of being friendly around humans. It was selected, maintained, and refined because it solved a practical problem in the field. The DNA findings make that invisible history readable, the trials make it observable, and the institutional research shows that the question is still open, still being traced through living dogs whose bodies carry the memory of what they were built to do. That is why the final picture feels larger than genetics alone. A sheepdog is not just a dog with a useful temperament. It is the result of a long human choice to preserve a behavior, reward it, and pass it forward until it became part of the breed itself. If this deeper history gives the science more meaning for you, stay with the next story too, because the most revealing part is often not the gene itself, but the kind of life humans decided that gene should serve. And if it's changed how you look at the dog next to you, subscribe and share this one with someone who owns a working breed. This kind of history deserves to keep being told.